Hi everybody, this is Robin for Chess24, and in this video I'm gonna analyze one of the most exciting games of 2016 so far. It was an encounter between the two leaders of the candidates tournament, which is Sergei Karjakin versus Fabiano Caruana. Prior to this game, those two players were leading the candidates tournament, of which the winner will be challenging Magnus Carlsen in a match in New York for the World Championship. And these two players were tied at 7.5 points out of 13. Now, the situation prior to this match was quite complicated. Only Karjakin and Caruana were still able to win the tournament at this point. However, due to an interesting tiebreak system, the winner of the match Anand against Sweetler, that you can see on plays 3 and 4, also was quite important for the final standings of the tournament. Caruana was most likely going to win as black against Karjakin in their direct encounter. However, had Vishy Anand won his game against Sweetler, which ended up not happening, he would have won the tournament as well by drawing against Sergei Karjakin, which would have changed the tiebreak system somewhat. Let's go to the game, which was a very interesting struggle. So Sergei Karjakin was playing as white, and clearly he was in a situation in which most likely a draw would have been enough for him. And he opened up the game with e4. Now, Sergei Karjakin is originally an e4 player, and when it comes to a game as tense as this one, most of the times a player tries to play what he knows best, and Sergei Karjakin, being a lifelong e4 player, clearly didn't want to opt for any surprises for himself, so he opened with this move. And Caruana, thinking that he should play for a win, obviously had to choose something a little bit offbeat and a little bit sharp. And he went for the Sicilian, whereas most of the time nowadays he opens with e5 and very often goes for the Berlin defense. Not in this game. E4, c5, knight f3, knight c6 was played, inviting another major opening variation, the Rosalima with bishop to b5, which is a complicated variation, so probably something Caruana was prepared for. But Sergei Karjakin went for the usual move d4, and this turned into an open Sicilian. Here, black could have opted for e5, which would be the Sveshnikov variation, but Caruana went d6, which is the start of the classical Sicilian, and after bishop to g5, which is the main line, we're entering the Rouser territory. e6, queen d2, this is all still very well known. a6 is the main line, long castle, and bishop to d7. Now, this is an opening system that, before I became a Grandmaster, was my main repertoire, and I was very interested to see this appear. Here, white can play two major moves, either f3 or f4. They're quite different in style. f3 clearly looks a little bit more like an English attack, and the game could continue something like bishop to e7, bishop e3. Slightly awkward move, moving the same piece again in the opening, but since this knight does not have a good square on the queen side or in the center to flee from after a potential g4, g5, this is considered to be quite dangerous, and black generally tries to go h5 here, stopping the expansion on the king side. Well, this would have led the game into a completely different course. In the game, f4, which is kind of the main line nowadays, was played, and black answered with h6. And after bishop h4, black went b5, where my pet line was always to go g5, which is a very interesting positional pawn sacrifice. There are some tricks to this line, and it leads to a completely different kind of game. One of the main ideas or traps that white should not fall for, is to go knight to f3, which looks like a very good move at first, protecting the bishop on h4 and supporting the pawn on g5. However, back in the day I won a lot of games because after h takes g5, bishop takes g5, f6, bishop to f4, e5, you're forcing white to move the bishop to e3, which is obviously not a very good move, because after knight takes e3, queen takes e3, bishop to h6, we can see that the queen is actually lost, which means a winning position for black. Now, I remember from back in the day that after something like bishop to c4, white does keep a little bit of compensation, but clearly this is not a very good idea. However, this line sort of went out of fashion when moves like g3 came up and knight takes c6 as well, and soon after I also stopped playing it, and I was not surprised to see that Fabiano Caruana, being a world-class player, went for something else, and he played the move b5. Now, this is also a slightly new trend in the Rouser variation, because originally people always went for the move b5 over here. And after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, we reach a position which is very similar to the position in the game. However, recently the Chinese Grandmaster Li Chao, who I admittedly lost to in this very variation that happened in this game, decided to add in the move h6 over here and go b5 at this point. Now the most natural and probably strongest move over here is still bishop takes f6. And after queen takes f6, and this is also the problem in the line without h6, after e5, d takes e5, knight takes b5, we see that some tactics are working in white's favor over here as he's attacking the bishop on d7 and also threatening annoying moves such as knight c7 check. Not a very good idea for black, obviously. So black can't really take back with the queen on f6, has to allow this structural damage with g takes f6. And what we see here is that black basically has this extra move h6 compared to the original main line. And it's not entirely clear whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but when you see that Karjakin's move in this game was f5, which is aimed to attack one of the most important points in black's position, the e6 pawn, it makes sense because in some lines the queen might be dropping to h6. Imagine a potential attack on the f pawn in the future on f6. And the bishop having to go to e7. You've now got the h6 square covered with your pawn there, being protected by the rook. So the difference is very slight, but clearly it steers the game into slightly unknown territory. And that was exactly what Caruana was looking for in this game. So an interesting opening choice by him. The game went on with queen to b6, a logical move forcing some sort of a decision by white. With regard to the knight on d4. One thing that white doesn't want to do is just develop his piece over here, any of them, and allow an exchange of queens. Generally, white should try to keep the queens on the board as black has two bishops and a majority in the center, so this should be a pretty good position for black. So the game followed with f takes e6, which came to me as a slight surprise. It's probably not a bad move, but since it's not very favorable for black to ever take on f5, which would kind of give white a lot of opportunities to go knight to d5, but also his pawn structure would not end up looking very nice. White could have taken at e6 at a later point of this game, but okay, Sergey decided to go for f takes e6. Caruana played f takes e6, and here he took on c6. Other moves could have been knight to f3 or knight to b3, but this one is probably the most straightforward option. Here, black has two major options, queen takes e6 or bishop takes e6. In the game, Caruana played queen takes c6, which has its drawbacks, but also its advantages. Of course, it's arguable whether the bishop is better on c6 because it directly attacks the e4 pawn. However, it's a little bit more safe to take with the queen as it keeps the e6 pawn protected, and generally black will remove the queen to c5 to cover the fifth rank over here, as we will see in the game. Bishop to d3, developing some more pieces, and h5, which might seem like a bit of a loss of time since black has played h6 earlier, but keep in mind that the bishop was kicked to h4 and then went on to take on f6, so it doesn't matter too much. And one of the main ideas of this move is to activate the bishop by placing it on h6. King to b1, stepping out of the attack. And here b4 was played, knight to e2, and queen is c5. So clearly, black is in a somewhat vulnerable position as he has several pawns that could potentially be attacked. Mostly the f pawn is an easy target. At the same time, he has some very nice dark squares he could use. For example, the queen would be well placed on e5, and potentially even the bishop, if it can ever reach e5, that would be a very good square. White went on to attack the f-pawn with rook hf1, bishop h6, and queen to e1. Now, this is kind of an interesting moment because most players would probably, as a first intuitive move, play either queen to e5, which would not be very good because it probably drops the b4 pawn, or king to e7, which looks a little dangerous because the king, of course, is placed in the center, but it's not too uncommon in this variant of the Sicilian. And you protect the f-pawn. However, after some thought over here, Caruana actually came up with a pretty interesting solution, and he just played a5, preparing an attack on the queen side. And it appears that after the logical move rook takes f6, bishop to g7, and let's say rook f3, there's definitely some compensation over here for black after queen e5 when mate is threatened. So by removing that pawn, white has given black some attacking chances over the long diagonal. And after something like this, with more pressure coming towards white's king, it is really looking quite scary for white. So Karjakin probably made a wise choice and ignored the f6 pawn for now. Played another somewhat surprising move, but actually probably a good move, which is b3. Now, of course, this is inviting black to go a4, but one thing is that white's pieces currently are a little bit tied up, especially the knight has no real good square to go for. He could have also opted for something like knight to f4, but after bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, king e7, followed by the queen coming to e5, probably wasn't too big of a deal. Also queen e5 immediately would be a decent move. And the position would be roughly equal, but perhaps black could hope for a slight advantage in the long run, as in the endgame, these types of structures tend to favor black, who doesn't have any isolated pawns. The h-pawn is not particularly weak, and a nice open file, half open file on the g-file. So b3 was played with the idea of bishop to c4 and knight to d4, which is a lot more active. And after rook g8, attacking the g-pawn, g3, black now went king e7, finally protecting the f-pawn. Bishop c4 followed. So at this point, when I was watching the game, I got a little bit worried for Fabiano Caruana, because the move knight to d4 looks very threatening with the idea of potentially something like knight f5 check, but also simply the fact that the e-pawn is now under some pressure, and you never really want to move that pawn up because it would give two squares away, which can be quite important. I was a bit worried for black, but he came up with a very interesting move, bishop to e3. And this not only prevents knight to d4, it also sort of highlights the fact that white is not very comfortable with all these pieces on e1, d1, f1, e2, and so on. White could switch back to knight f4, but that once again wasn't really his idea. And another thing is that you don't really want to allow black's bishop to come to this diagonal, where, for example, it could sit very comfortably on c3. Of course, the position remains complicated, but it might look a little bit dangerous, especially during the game, when a4 is black's next move and black has a nice attacking piece here. So Sergei Karjakin came up with this move rook to f3 over here, and the idea was to go rook to d3, attacking this bishop on e3, followed by knight d4, and white is able to continue his old plan. Now, for a while I thought that a4 would be the most logical move, but then again, white will be able to carry out this plan, and after a takes b3, normally white will probably capture with bishop takes b3, and a similar structure arose in the game. And even though it looks a little bit, it doesn't look very good to take back with the bishop, isolating both of these pawns. The bishop does a very good multi-sort of purpose job, attacking the pawn on e6, but also defending both of these pawns on a2 and c2. So this would have been a bit better for white. Instead, after rook f3, Caruana played rook to g4, attacking the e4 pawn, which is not that easy to defend at this point. And after rook d3, of course, rook takes e4 would have been very convenient. White could still use the pin of this bishop because the rook is unprotected, and he will gain some material out of it, but after rook takes c4, which is an exchange sacrifice, b takes c4, bishop to h6, it is one of those positions where perhaps black's king is even safer now than white's, and the material deficit is actually small. Black could easily go for some sort of endgame over here. Imagine he would go knight to b3. Now queen takes c4 would not be a very good idea because the knight would come into the game and some threats will be formed around black's king. But after queen to e5, this would be typically what black would like to aim for. On the next moves, he could think about getting back to that long diagonal, and also the endgame here would be very promising for him with either f takes or g takes e5. But let's say f takes. The bishop pair would plus one pawn, and a bunch of central pawns would definitely compensate for the exchange. So, not rook d3, but queen to f1 was played, which was once again targeting that point on f6, which is always a little bit loose in this variation. And of course black has to defend that because it's very important for his king to keep that pawn alive. So rook f8 was played, and here Sergey switched to knight f4, admitting that he can't do much. Rook d3 still falls for rook takes e4, and once again this looks good for black. So knight to f4 was played. The bishop now might feel a little uncomfortable, and therefore Fabiano decided to take on f4. One thing that white had to take, or black had to take into account, is that sometimes white might be able to take this pawn. Imagine he would, for example, play a4. Something like knight takes h5 could be interesting. Also knight to d3, also highlighting the fact that the bishop is not so well defended, could be annoying. And here even moves with related, or ideas related to e5 are very dangerous. So again, black has to be very precise when playing these sharp Sicilian variations, especially with a king in the center. So bishop takes f4 in this position was played, and it's probably the most safe and best move. G takes f4 was a major option here, but Sergey Karjakin decided not to go for it because after rook to g8, black does get some counterplay on the g file. However, normally I would say that this is the right way for white to play, because f5 would come next, and this would once again highlight that this pawn on e6 is very important. If you would ever have to move it up, then the d5 square would become vacant for the white pieces, and that could be a very important detail positionally. So rook takes f4 was played instead because rook g8 was something that Karjakin didn't really fancy facing. And here a4 was played, and another impressive decision in this game by Sergey Karjakin. Most players here would sort of ignore this pawn on a4 and think to themselves, well, it can come to a3, but probably I just have to deal with it once it gets there. Maybe I should focus on c3 when the pawn gets there. Instead of allowing black an extra attacker with a3, which then would probably be followed by queen a5, and of course black is eyeing the b2 square to deliver a mate. Sergey actually took on a4, and as I was saying before, it's not a pretty decision by any means, but after bishop takes a4, now white could potentially get his bishop back to b3, as happened in the game, and his king feels a lot more comfortable in this type of scenario. So white played queen to d3, sort of regrouping his queen back into the center. Black played bishop to c6, as the bishop doesn't have all that much to do on a4, and bishop to b3 was played. Now, in this position, most players have to start thinking about shuffling around a little bit, and it's not that easy for black to find a plan. He went rook to g5. And personally, I was expecting white to make kind of a waiting move over here. I wasn't quite sure. Perhaps it would have been an idea to go rook h4 and try to attack the h-pawn or put more pressure on the f-pawn in some way. Maybe just play queen e2. But instead, Karjakin, whilst the players were getting somewhat lower on time, went for a very sharp continuation. Played the move and actually pawn sacrifice e5. Now there's actually only one comfortable reply for black at this point against this move. After the logical d takes e5, it appears that rook c4 actually wins the game. It looks like black might hold on after queen to d5, sort of hoping to exchange queens in time, but after check, rook to f7 virtually forced, rook takes d5, rook takes h7. Black is still doing okay, but after rook takes c6, e takes d5, white has this very important check on c7, picking up the rook on h7, and white is winning. So going back to e5, this was not really an option. Likewise, the move f takes e5 loses to queen h7 as well. And after, for example, king e8, now another rook swings into black's position, and most likely it would follow up with a quick mate. So in this position, black had to recapture with rook takes e5. And here there's no direct threat, such as queen h7, because black could comfortably play rook to f7. And as we can see, this structure is still standing, which is very important. And no direct threats are there. White does have this annoying move rook to c4, which was played in the game. And of course now the same trick would still apply. If we go for this variation, rook takes d5, rook takes h7. It all looks okay for now, but actually here rook takes e5, but also rook takes c6, the same idea would still work after rook c7 check. We pick up the rook on h7. But Caruana, being a very good tactician, of course saw an idea for black over here and played the move rook to d5. And this is a very strong counter attack. If white now decides to take on c5, black comfortably takes on d3 and manages to recapture on the next move, and he stays up a pawn. So white had to do something else after rook d5 and played queen to e2. Black on queen b6, and as we can see, actually at this point people, and I personally thought that black's winning chances started to become, well, realistic. He's a pawn up, he's still no clear threat to his king, and here white played rook to h4, attacking the h-pawn, but even if he does end up getting the h-pawn, it might not be the end of the world, because those central pawns are also in the endings a lot more important than a or an h-pawn. So black played rook to e5, queen d3, renewing the threat on d6. There was a strange option over here of playing queen to c5, which would have followed a very weird move repetition. Over here we're actually back in the same position. But as I said before, this was basically a must-win game for Fabiano Caruana playing with black, so this was not really an option for him. Instead, after queen d3, he played a very odd-looking move to my mind, the move bishop to g2. Now, what could be the idea of this move? Actually, black wants to play this move d5, and he also had the option of doing it here, playing this move. But white would probably play something like queen to d2, trying to pick up this pawn and also eyeing the h6 square and maybe attacking the h-pawn. So one of the major problems here is that black would actually like to put his bishop to e4, where it would basically protect this pawn by cutting off the rook from h4, and also doing a good job potentially protecting the king by covering this diagonal. Now, bishop to g2 basically tries to get the bishop to e4, and black aims to go d5 on the next move. Again, white is kind of struggling to win back the pawn. Queen d2 might look like a good move, attacking both the bishop and the pawn on b4. But over here, black has this move bishop to e4 immediately now, and he will go d5 on the next move. And black is a little bit better. So in this position, after bishop g2, white went rook to d4, attacking the d-pawn and basically forcing d5, and played queen d2. Now, we actually come to probably what is the most important moment, not only in the game, but in the whole tournament. At this point, Fabiano Caruana had played an excellent game, really creating chances as black from an opening which is not considered to be very good and is not very commonly seen at the highest level. And at this point, I think Fabiano wanted to cash in. He felt like he saw an opportunity of keeping the pawn on b4 alive and exchanging some pieces in the process, which of course would be a good thing for black, because not only does he have all these central pawns, but also his king would be a lot safer, the fewer pieces will be around. So he went for this move rook to e4. And when I saw this move, I thought it would be a very, very good idea. One of the main ideas is that after queen takes g2, because the bishop of course is hanging, black can just take on d4. Whereas if you take on e4 here as white, bishop takes e4, and white might be able to get back the h-pawn, but as we said before, it's not that big of a deal. Black might be able to get active now, playing something like queen f2, even rook c8 looks interesting. Or actually maybe not rook to c8, but rook to g8, queen takes h5, and queen to e3 would have been a decent way to activate your pieces. Bishop to f3 would be a threat. And once again, this bishop is actually kind of out of play. It still does a very good job defending, but it's not quite as good as the bishop on e4. So everything looked great for black in this position. Rook to e4, very strong tactical move. And Karjakin thought for a long time over here and came up with this shocking, amazing idea. Rook takes d5, giving up a full rook for just a few threats against the white king. Now obviously white is immediately threatening queen d7 checkmate, and it's not that easy for black to defend, but the real crux of this idea can be found after queen to c7, which was actually played in the game. And here Karjakin followed up with the move queen to f5. So take into account, black is actually still up a whole rook in this position, but there seems to be no good defense as the threats around this king are sort of piling up. Queen h7 is probably the most annoying out of all of them to deal with. And there seems to be no real good way to fight that idea. Now, there are some moves that might look good over here. For example, king to e8, but then bishop a4 check, coming suddenly from the other side of the board. King e7, rook d7 check, and black's getting mated. Another idea might be something like queen to c6, which may have been the toughest move, which was not played in the game. But after queen h7 check, king e8, first of all, considering the tournament situation, Sergei Karjakin could have easily made a draw here. We will never really find out what he had planned. But another good idea would have been to first pick up the pawn on h5 with check. As we can see, the king can only move to e7, so black will go king e7. And here there is a very nice resource by playing queen to a7 all the way to the other side of the board. White is once again preparing this killer idea of bishop to a4, and as we can see, not only is the queen actually under attack, but if we move it away any place on the board, imagine we're going to c8, it actually leads to a checkmate as black has no good place for his king. So queen to a7 would have been a very nice way to finish this game. After queen f5, basically there was not that much to do anymore, but Fabiano Caruana tried to move rook to f7. But after the simple bishop takes f7, it appears that black is also lost because king takes f7 loses the queen h7 check, the king moves, and the queen on c7 is lost. So what would have been the very best way to deal with this idea rook takes d5? Now actually, probably after this move, when there seems to be no much better way than queen c7, black is probably lost. Another move that he could have tried is f5, but after queen d7 check, king f7, king f6, rook d6 check, at least he's losing back his queen, and probably this position is much better for white as he has a much safer king, and the queen is at least, queen and a pawn is at least as good as the two rooks. One very strong move would be to immediately attack the bishop on g2 and prepare another check on g5, and white should probably win this as well. The best move over here would have been rook to d4, which was obviously not played by Fabiano because after the following sequence, white is in no danger of losing, and considering it was a must-win game for him, there was not a real point in trying this either. So queen to f5, rook to f7 was played. After bishop takes f7, queen to e5 happened, but here actually white finished up with a forced mate. Rook to d7 check, king f8 is forced, and rook d8 check. Now all the variations lead into mates, but most noteworthy is probably king takes f7, queen h7 check, king e6, and a very nice mate to end this spectacular combination of rook takes d5, queen d7 checkmate. The two other king moves also fail. After rook d8 check, king e7, there's another queen d7 checkmate, and after king g7, there's queen g6 checkmate. So Fabiano Caruana resigned, and actually Karjakin won the tournament. Now let's bring up the final standings of the Moscow Candidates Tournament. As we can see, the game between Peter Svidler and Viswanathan Anand, the former world chess champion before Magnus Carlsen, ended in a draw. So Caruana and Anand shared the second place, but Karjakin ended up with +3 and a 1-point lead over Caruana after winning their encounter. It was a very good game from both players. Once again, I think that Caruana did a very good job actually creating a lot of play in this game, but you have to give Karjakin a lot of credit for finding this really cool move, rook takes d5. Now to finish up, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think. Do you think Karjakin is going to be a good challenger for Magnus? Do you think he's going to have some chances to win the match? Let me know. Drop it in the comments, and I hope to see you back. This was Robin for Chess24.